So picture this. It's 2006, and there's this high court judge in London. He's issuing a highly anticipated legal verdict on like a massive copyright lawsuit.
Right, which sounds incredibly dry. I mean, it was this dense 71-page document just filled with complex legal jargon.
Yeah, totally dry. But hidden inside this official published legal judgment was an actual encrypted secret code.
It is still just one of the most surreal moments in modern legal history.
Right, like the judge had meticulously italicized these seemingly random letters all throughout the text. It sounds exactly like the plot of a cheap airport thriller.
Absolutely, but it was entirely real. And it was basically the bizarre climax to this enormous cultural earthquake caused by a single piece of fiction.
Yeah, so when you actually decrypt the text, it read, wait, let me check in my notes, it read, Smithy Code Jackie Fisher, who are you dreadnought?
Yeah, that's it. It was a completely personal, esoteric reference by the judge, Sir Peter Smith, to a British admiral.
Which is just wild.
I know, right? He essentially decided to play a game of hidden symbology right in the middle of a high court ruling.
And I think that tells you everything you need to know about the absolute grip this whole phenomenon had on the world.
Oh, without a doubt. It was inescapable.
So today's deep dive is all about unpacking that massive cultural, historical, and literary hurricane that is Dan Brown's bibliography. We're specifically focusing on the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons.
Yeah, we are talking about a franchise that sold over 80 million copies worldwide. I mean, it didn't just entertain people on a long flight.
No, it completely hijacked the public sense of reality.
Exactly. It enraged centuries-old religious institutions. It sparked massive academic debates. And, as we just heard, it turned British judges into amateur cryptographers.
Which is just so funny to me. But, the scale of the reaction is what makes this such an important subject for us to analyze today.
Right, because when you have official boycotts from the Vatican and international lawsuits, you're not just looking at a popular book anymore.
Yeah, you're looking at a text that is somehow, short-circuited the way millions of people process historical truth.
So to figure out how on earth a fast-paced paperback managed to do that, we're synthesizing a really rich stack of source materials today.
Yeah, we've got a comprehensive encyclopedic breakdown of all the controversies. We have literary study guides and an academic paper specifically focused on the representation of secret societies in these books.
Plus, there's this fascinating literary analysis of postmodernism in his work, a Rosicrucian mystical review, and a highly detailed scholarly feminist critique of the text.
Which gives us a really awesome multidisciplinary lens. We are going to look at theology, art history, gender studies, cryptography, and, legal theory to deconstruct the mechanics of this whole thing.
And for you listening, we really want to explore why you and millions of others might have been so captivated by these stories.
Yeah, because even if you haven't read the books in 20 years, or, maybe you only saw the Tom Hanks movies, the blurring of fact and fiction here acts as a massive mirror for how we process truth in the modern world.
Absolutely. So let's start with the setup, because before we get into the historical debates and all the angry theologians, we have to look at the psychological trick the book plays on literally page 1.
Oh, the framing device. It's so clever.
It is the engine of the entire controversy. So, the Da Vinci Code opens with a single page placed right before the prologue, and it's boldly titled Fact.
Right. Fact. Just putting it right out there.
Yeah. And on this page, the author asserts that all the art, architecture documents, and secret rituals depicted in the novel are entirely true.
And he explicitly mentions the Priory of Sion and Opus Ganaia as factual existing organizations.
Right. And he didn't just leave that claim tucked inside the book cover.
No, he really leaned into it. I'm looking at the notes from his media tours back in the early 2000s, and he went on CNN, he went on the Today Show.
Yeah, he was everywhere.
And when interviewers asked him, how much of this wild historical conspiracy was fabricated, he didn't give the standard novelist answer.
No, he didn't say, oh, it's just a fun what-if scenario.
Right. He literally claimed that 99% of it is true.
Which is a bold claim.
I mean, he would concede that Robert Langdon, the Harvard symbologist running around Paris, was a fictional character.
Yeah.
But he insisted the historical foundation he was running on was rock solid.
And that media strategy completely shifted the interpretive lens of the reader.
How so?
Well, our sources looking at the literary analysis point out that this specific blurring of lines is a textbook example of postmodernism.
Okay, postmodernism.
And more specifically, it's a genre technique called historiographic metafiction.
Okay, historiographic metafiction is a lot of syllables. We need you to unpack that a bit.
Sure.
Are you basically saying that if I put real historical figures, like, say, Leonardo da Vinci, into a room with a fictional murder, my brain naturally assumes the murder must be real too, just because the walls of the room are painted with verifiable facts?
You're definitely touching on the core mechanism there, but it goes a bit deeper philosophically, you know?
Okay, take me deeper.
So postmodernism as a literary movement is deeply skeptical of what they call grand narratives.
Grand narratives,
That's good.
like big, sweeping histories.
Exactly. A grand narrative is any sweeping, overarching historical theory or belief system that claims to offer an objective explanation of reality.
Oh, I see. So like traditional Orthodox history books are grand narratives.
Right. And major world religions are definitely grand narratives.
Gotcha.
So historiographic metafiction actively tries to subvert these grand narratives. It does this by aggressively mixing actual, verifiable historical data with fictional speculation.
So it deliberately forces the reader to question how history is recorded in the first place.
Yes, and more importantly, who gets to record it?
So it's basically a literary tool designed to make you distrust the official story.
Exactly. The literary analysis in our sources draws heavily on post-structuralist thinkers to explain this dynamic. They specifically reference Roland Barthes.
Oh, the French theorist, right.
Yeah, the one who coined the concept of the death of the author.
Right, which I have to say sounds like a true crime podcast title.
It really does.
But I know it's a literary theory. It basically means the author's original intent no longer dictates what the book actually means once it's out in the world, right?
Spot on. Barthes argued that meaning isn't some fixed object implanted by the writer. Meaning is actually generated in the hands of the reader.
Because the reader brings their own baggage, right?
Exactly. They bring their own context, biases, and suspicions to the text.
Okay, so by placing the word fact at the front of a novel and then seamlessly blending, real paintings in the Louvre with a fabricated ancient conspiracy.
The text actively destabilizes the reader's fixed truths. It suggests that what we consider history is highly subjective. It's shaped by language, perspective, and power dynamics.
It's like a magician letting you inspect 3 real, solid, heavy coins before pulling a fake one out of your ear.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. Yeah, you trust the fake because the setup was so incredibly grounded in reality. The sleight of hand only works because you established a baseline of trust.
That is exactly how the book functions.
But I have a major question here, based on our sources.
Lay it on me.
Is Dan Brown intentionally crafting this brilliant postmodern masterpiece meant to philosophically deconstruct our reality? Or is he just a guy who wrote a really catchy, fast-paced thriller, and now all these academic critics are projecting high-level theory onto him?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources show a really deep divide on his intent.
I bet they do.
Yeah, the literary critiques suggest it functions as a highly intentional postmodern framework. However, the legal and historical critiques, which we will dive into shortly, argue that the research was incredibly superficial.
So they think he just wanted to sell books.
Right, that it was designed purely for narrative tension and maximizing sales, not some deep philosophical deconstruction.
That makes sense.
But the beauty of Roland Barthes' theory is that Brown's actual intent is totally irrelevant.
Oh, wow. Because the cultural reaction made it a postmodern masterpiece.
Exactly. The fact that millions of readers started questioning the foundational narratives of Western civilization because of a paperback thriller, that absolutely proves the postmodernist point.
Reality is malleable, and narrative holds immense power. The impact is the reality. That's wild.
It really is.
Okay, so we've established how the book primed its audience to accept fiction as fact. Now let's look at the specific grand narratives the book targeted.
Right, because he didn't just go after a minor historical footnote or some forgotten king.
No, he went after the foundational history of Christianity.
Which is precisely why it triggered a real-world institutional earthquake. To understand the backlash, we really have to lay out the core, explosive claims the book presents as its hidden truth.
Right. So the central premise, the huge reveal of the Da Vinci Code, is a redefinition of the Holy Grail.
Yes.
The book claims the Grail is not the literal cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. It claims the word Grail, or Saint Grail in Old French, actually translates to sangreal, meaning royal blood.
Which is such a Clever linguistic flip.
It is. So the Holy Grail is a bloodline. Specifically, the book asserts that Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene were married, that they had a child, and that their descendants fled to Gaul, which is modern-day France, and eventually became the Merovingian dynasty.
And that is the first massive pillar of the conspiracy.
Right.
The second pillar is the mechanism of the cover-up. The novel asserts that early Christianity was very pluralistic, and that the modern Orthodox view of Jesus was essentially fabricated centuries later.
Fabricated at the Council of Nicaea, right, in the 4th century.
Yes, orchestrated by the Roman Emperor Constantine.
The book claims Constantine wanted to unify the Roman Empire, so he held a literal vote to elevate Jesus from a mortal prophet to a divine being.
Right.
And to solidify this new narrative, the book alleges Constantine ordered the destruction of 80 Gnostic Gospels that portrayed Jesus as entirely human.
Exactly, while explicitly elevating Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they portrayed him as a god.
I mean, it is a narrative that completely upends 2,000 years of Orthodox Christian theology.
It completely flips the board over. You can easily see why institutions were mobilizing against it.
Absolutely.
But when you look at the historical rebuttals from our sources, the historians and theologians completely dismantle this timeline. Let's start with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Right, let's get into it. Did Constantine invent the divinity of Jesus to consolidate political power?
The historical pushback on this is absolute. The idea that Constantine invented Jesus' divinity out of whole cloth is just fundamentally incorrect.
Interesting. Why?
Because the New Testament authors, writing in the 1st century long before Nicaea, already wrote about Jesus as divine.
So the belief was already there.
Yes. The early Christian communities worshipped him as divine for hundreds of years before Constantine was even born.
Wait, so if they already believed he was divine, what on earth were they voting on at the Council of Nicaea? Why drag hundreds of bishops across the empire for a massive summit if they already agreed?
Well, because theology is complicated. They were trying to iron out the specific metaphysical mechanics of that divinity.
Mechanics.
Yeah, they were debating his exact relationship to God the Father. This is known as the Arian controversy.
The Arian controversy. Okay, break that down for me.
So a priest named Arius was arguing that if Jesus was the Son, then he must have been created by the Father at some point in time.
Right, that makes logical sense.
Therefore, the Son was subordinate to the Father, a created being, albeit the highest created being.
Okay, so Arius is saying Jesus is divine, but like a slightly lesser tier of divine than God the Father.
Yes. And the opposing side, led by figures like Athanasius, argued that Jesus was homoousios, which is a Greek term meaning of the same substance or consubstantial with the Father.
Of the same substance.
Right, meaning he was co-eternal, uncreated, fully equal to God. They weren't voting on if he was divine. They were debating the specific granular nature of that divinity.
Wow. Okay. I can definitely see why a novelist would want to simplify that. I mean, they voted to make him a god is a much punchier thriller plot than they argued over the Greek word homoousios to determine co-eternal consubstantiality.
It really doesn't roll off the tongue.
No, it does not. But why was this such a massive deal at the time? Why did the emperor care about this semantic difference enough to call a massive council?
Because back then, religion and politics were inextricably linked. This theological debate wasn't just happening quietly in monasteries.
It was a public thing.
Oh, it was tearing the Roman Empire apart. Our historical sources note that you could go to the market in Alexandria to buy bread, and the baker would literally try to argue with you about whether the Son was created or uncreated.
You're kidding. At the bakery?
Yeah, it was causing riots. Constantine needed a unified church to help unify a fracturing empire. He didn't care as much about the theological outcome as he cared about just ending the riots.
That paints such a different picture of history. It's not this smoke-filled room of men inventing a religion. It's an emperor trying to stop his citizens from killing each other over metaphysical technicalities.
Precisely.
Okay, what about the book's claim regarding the 80 Gnostic Gospels? You know, the ones Constantine supposedly destroyed because they portrayed a mortal human Jesus.
This is perhaps the sharpest historical irony in the entire controversy.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, the book claims these Gnostic texts were suppressed because they humanized Jesus, showing him as a mortal who could get married and have children. But our sources show that the reality of Gnosticism is the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. How so?
Gnosticism wasn't a single organized religion, but a collection of belief systems that generally shared a specific cosmology.
Okay.
They viewed the material, world-like, physical matter, human bodies, the earth itself, as inherently evil, flawed, or a prison created by a lesser malevolent deity called the demiurge.
Wow. So physical stuff is bad.
Yes. The true high God was purely spiritual. Therefore, they believed that a divine spirit, like Christ, would never genuinely take on a true physical human body.
Because the flesh is corrupt and spirit is pure.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. So if I'm a Gnostic, the idea of Jesus having a physical human body is actually deeply offensive to my worldview.
Entirely offensive. Some Gnostic sects even believe Jesus only appeared to have a physical body like some sort of spiritual hologram.
A hologram.
Yeah. So the texts found at Nag Hammadi, which are the famous lost Gnostic Gospels, depict Jesus as purely divine and otherworldly. They severely lack the humanizing physical details found in the canonical Gospels.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you won't find details like Jesus weeping, bleeding, or feeling pain in those texts.
So if the Gnostics hated physical matter, they would be the last people on earth to write a gospel about Jesus enjoying physical intimacy, getting married, and having biological children.
Precisely. It completely breaks the internal logic of the book's premise.
That's crazy. The book essentially uses the word Gnostic to sound ancient and mysterious, while assigning them beliefs that are the exact opposite of what they actually held.
That is precisely what the academic historians pointed out. It is a massive inversion of historical reality.
Which brings us to Mary Magdalene.
Right.
The book asserts she was of the royal tribe of Benjamin, and that she was maliciously labeled a prostitute by the Catholic Church purely to smear her reputation and hide the fact that she was the true Holy Grail, the mother of the sacred bloodline.
We can break that down into the geographic claim and the theological claim.
Let's do it.
First, the historians in our sources dispute the genealogical claim simply based on geography.
Because of where she was from.
Yes. Her namesake, Magdala, was a town located in the northern region of Galilee. The tribe of Benjamin historically resided way down in the south, near Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
So the idea that she was a Benjaminite royal lacks serious historical grounding.
That makes sense. And what about the prostitute label? Did the church actually do that?
Well, this is a layered issue. Yes, the church did historically conflate her with other women in the Bible, but the motivation is highly debated.
Okay, lay it out for me.
The Latin Church traditionally identified Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, who was the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and an unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke as all being the exact same person.
They just merged them all together.
Yeah. And this conflation was solidified by a very popular sermon given by Pope Gregory I in the year 591.
So Brown is right that the church called her a prostitute.
It's messier than a deliberate, malicious cover-up.
Okay.
The conflation happened, but our sources point out there is no historical evidence that Pope Gregory was executing some conspiracy to defame her or hide a secret marriage.
So why did he do it?
In early biblical exegesis, scholars often tried to streamline the narrative by combining characters with similar names or actions. It was a popular, albeit incorrect, interpretation of the text that just stuck in the Western Church for centuries.
It's almost like early Christian fan fiction, trying to tie up loose plot holes by combining characters.
That's a funny way to look at it, but yeah, kind of. But crucially, the Catholic Church officially retracted this conflation in 1969, decoupling Mary Magdalene from the unnamed sinful woman.
Oh, in 1969, so decades before Dan Brown wrote his novel.
Exactly. Furthermore, even during the centuries of conflation, she wasn't vilified. She was heavily venerated as a major saint.
She was?
Yes, she was seen as the ultimate model of repentance and the apostle to the apostles because she was the first witness to the resurrection.
Okay, so the religious history is creatively interpreted to an extreme degree. But let's look at the pure science and logic of the bloodline itself.
Let's look at the math.
Right. The idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a child, and those descendants are living in secret today.
This is where the narrative runs into the hard wall of mathematics and genetics. We have a source citing Steve Olson, a prominent geneticist. He noted a glaring statistical flaw in the book's core premise regarding the Merovingian bloodline.
Break the math down for us.
It involves a concept called pedigree collapse.
Pedigree collapse. What's that?
If you go back one generation, you have two ancestors. 2 generations, 4, 3 generations, 8. The number doubles every single generation.
Simple enough.
Right. But if you go back 2,000 years, which is roughly 80 generations, the mathematical number of ancestors you should have is larger than the total number of human beings who have ever lived on Earth.
Wait, oh, I see. Which means family trees aren't actually trees, they're webs. Cousins, Mary cousins, lions crossover.
Exactly. Because of pedigree collapse, if anyone living 2,000 years ago had children and that lineage survived and propagated without dying out, the mathematics of human genetics dictate that a vast, vast portion of the planet's current population would be descended from them.
Really?
Yeah, you hit what's called a genetic isopoint.
So if Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a child whose line survived, it wouldn't just result in a handful of elite French people hiding in a secret society today.
No, not at all.
It would mean that basically everyone in Europe, the Americas, and the Middle East would be part of the royal bloodline.
Precisely. The concept of a tiny, exclusive, ancient bloodline surviving for 2 millennia without branching out to include millions of people is scientifically impossible.
Unless what?
Unless that family practiced extreme, isolated inbreeding for 2,000 years.
Oh, wow. Which makes the idea of a secret society protecting one specific modern descendant totally absurd. You'd literally have to protect half of France.
Exactly.
And speaking of France, the historical timeline in the book is broken there as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The novel claims the Merovingians founded Paris, but historians note that Paris, then known as Lutetia, was settled by a Celtic tribe called the Parisi and later the Romans, centuries before the Merovingians rose to power in the 5th century.
So even the physical architecture gets debunked.
Oh,
I mean, one of the big set pieces in the book is the famous rose line at the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, which the book claims is an ancient pagan meridian line used to hide the Grail.
right, the rose line.
But the reality is so mundane. The church literally had to put up a sign pointing out that the brass strip on the floor is just an 18th century sundial.
Yep. Just an astronomical calendar meant to mark the solstices so they could calculate the date of Easter.
It has absolutely nothing to do with pagan secret societies.
The level of historical pushback from academics was incredibly granular, mainly because the book presented so many specific, testable claims.
Which brings me to a major logistical problem with the narrative itself. Even if we suspend our disbelief about the genetics and the sundials, let's just assume the bloodline existed.
Okay, let's assume it.
Why would a modern, large-scale, murderous cover-up be happening today?
It's a good question.
I mean, the book justifies the murders by saying the secret society must protect the Davidic bloodline, the ancient kingship of King Solomon, because releasing the secret would destroy the Vatican.
Right, that's the plot motivation.
But practically speaking, why would Solomon's ancient kingship matter enough in the 21st century to warrant assassination?
That is the exact logistical hole that historians like Carl Olson and Sandra Musil point out in our sources.
Glad I'm not the only one who thought of that.
They argue that having Davidic blood in 1st century Judea wouldn't have even been that unique. There were likely thousands of people who could trace their lineage back to King David.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so the idea that a 21st century secular world, or even the modern Catholic Church, would completely collapse because someone produced a genealogy chart linking a French citizen to King Solomon is just a massive stretch.
Yeah, people would probably just be like, oh, that's neat.
Exactly. It's a compelling narrative stake for a thriller to keep the pages turning, but as a real-world motivation, it completely falls apart under basic scrutiny.
So the history is incredibly porous. But the controversy wasn't just about debates over 4th century church councils and genetic math.
No, it wasn't.
Brown's narrative explicitly targeted modern living organizations. And that is what led to tangible, real-world consequences, institutional panic, and protests. We really have to talk about Opus Dei.
Yes, we do. If the historical claims ruffled the feathers of academics, the portrayal of Opus Dei caused a genuine institutional crisis for the Catholic Church.
So for those who don't remember the book's details, Opus Dei is portrayed as a highly secretive, deeply misogynistic, monastic order operating as the Pope's personal, almost militant prelature.
Right.
And the face of this organization in the book is a character named Silas. He's a murderous albino monk who practices extreme, bloody corporal mortification, whipping himself and wearing a spiked chain around his thigh called a cilice.
The reaction from the Catholic Church to this portrayal was swift and severe.
I can imagine.
Our sources note that high-ranking Vatican officials, including Archbishop Angelo Amato, specifically called for a global boycott of the film adaptation.
A global boycott?
He labeled the work full of calumnies, offenses, and historical and theological errors. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement rating it morally offensive.
Wow. So it wasn't just a few angry reviews.
Oh, the real-world impact was significant. In countries like India, the film faced immense protests from Christian groups, and the government actually required massive disclaimers stating it was purely a work of fiction before it could even be screened.
So we have this massive clash between a fictional thriller and a real-world institution. What is the actual reality of Opus Dei versus the fiction presented in the book?
The discrepancies are massive, starting with the most basic demographic facts.
Okay, let's hear them.
Opus Dei is not a monastic order. They have absolutely no monks.
Wait, no monks at all?
None. It is an institution primarily made up of lay members.
Lay members, like regular people?
Yes, regular people with everyday jobs, lawyers, teachers, doctors, plumbers, along with diocesan priests. The core philosophy of Opus Dei is actually finding holiness in ordinary, everyday work.
So Silas, the terrifying Opus Dei monk living in a cloister and taking assassination orders, is a total oxymoron from the start.
Completely. Furthermore, our sources explain that the term personal prelature, which the book uses ominously to imply a secret elite army reporting directly to the Pope.
Yeah, it sounds super sinister.
Right, but it's actually just bureaucratic church terminology.
Really?
Yeah, it means an institution whose jurisdiction is over persons wherever they live, rather than being tied to a specific geographical territory, like a standard diocese is.
Oh, so it's just an administrative designation, not a cloak and dagger status.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about the claims of deep-seated misogyny and authoritarianism? The book paints the head of Opus Dei as a supreme dictator making momentous, terrifying decisions completely alone.
Again, the sources counter this heavily. Defenders of the organization point out that approximately half of the leadership positions in Opus Dei are held by women.
Well, that directly counters the claim of institutional misogyny.
Yes. As for the authoritarianism, decision-making at the top of the organization is collegial. The head of Opus Dei does not rule by fiat. They actually have only one vote on a council.
Oh, interesting.
And they are typically accompanied by custodes or guardians who advise them. It is specifically designed to prevent a unilateral dictatorship.
Okay, but let's talk about the most visceral part of the Opus Dei depiction, the part that really shocked readers.
Silas and his bloody self-flagellation with the Silas? Is that entirely made up by Dan Brown to make the villains scary?
Here is where reality and fiction have a very thin, very uncomfortable overlap.
Uh-oh.
The bloody, murderous, obsessive depiction in the book is absolutely a severe caricature. However, corporal mortification of the flesh is a real historical Christian tradition.
Wait, really? Like actually hurting yourself for religious reasons?
Yes, our sources note it has been practiced by significant figures throughout history.
St. Anthony in the 3rd century, St. Thomas More in the Tudor era, and even modern, widely revered figures like Mother Teresa and Archbishop Oscar Romero practiced forms of corporal mortification.
Wow, I had no idea.
And yes, some numerary members of Opus Dei do practice voluntary mortification, which can include wearing a cilice for a couple of hours a day.
Why? What is the theological logic behind that? It just seems so extreme to a modern mindset.
The theological reasoning is tied to sharing in the physical suffering of Christ on the cross, and it's also used as a physical discipline to subdue earthly desires and focus the mind on the spiritual.
Okay, I sort of get the logic.
But it is meant to be a private, mild discomfort, not a bloody, self-mutilating horror show like Silas performs in the book. The church strictly prohibits mortification that causes genuine harm or threatens health.
Okay, so there is a kernel of truth there, but Dan Brown essentially dialed it up to 11 and covered it in fake blood for the sake of a thriller.
Exactly.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. I want to push back on Opus Dei's outrage.
Go for it.
We have a source, a scholar, who points out that Opus Dei is, by its very nature, a highly secretive organization. They are known to be influential in politics and business, and for a long time, members were actively discouraged from even revealing their membership publicly.
That is true.
So, when an organization insists on operating behind closed doors, wielding that kind of quiet influence in the halls of power, don't they naturally invite the public to project these wild, fictional conspiracies onto them? I mean, if you insist on operating in the shadows, you can't be entirely surprised when the public imagines monsters hiding there with you.
That is a very astute sociological observation. Secrecy creates a vacuum of information, and human nature absolutely abhors a vacuum.
We always want to fill in the blanks.
Yes. If an organization doesn't transparently define itself, popular culture will gladly do it for them, and usually in the most dramatic way possible.
Naturally.
And that dynamic, the human obsession with filling in the blanks of secretive groups, is exactly what makes the secret societies in Dan Brown's universe so alluring to the reader.
Right. So Brown essentially builds this empire by co-opting the natural human suspicion of institutional power. Because if the religious disputes angered the institutions, it was the secret societies and the hidden symbols that kept the audience turning the pages at 2 a.m.
Absolutely.
Let's decode the secret language Brown uses, starting with the Illuminati, which takes center stage in his previous book, Angels and Demons.
Okay, the Illuminati. Dan Brown portrays them as an ancient 1500s anti-Christian force, a hidden brotherhood of enlightened scientists and artists featuring figures like the astronomer Galileo.
Right, who are secretly fighting back against the oppression and anti-science stance of the Catholic Church.
Exactly, but the timeline doesn't work at all.
Yeah, that's what I read. Historically, the Bavarian Illuminati was founded centuries later, right, in 1776?
Yes, by a German philosopher and law professor named Adam Weishaupt.
So they weren't Renaissance scientists fighting the Inquisition alongside Galileo.
No, not at all. Weishaupt's goal was to promote Enlightenment ideals, rationalism, and to oppose religious influence over public life and state power.
So they were a real group.
They were a real group, but they were essentially a political and philosophical club in 18th century Germany. They were not 16th century assassins taking orders from Galileo to plant antimatter in the Vatican.
So Brown basically shifted the timeline by over 200 years just to force a dramatic confrontation between faith and science.
He did. It makes for a better story.
It does. But honestly, it's the visual symbols that really captured the public imagination. Let's look at some of the major ones. In Angels and Demons, a huge plot point relies on ambigrams.
Right, ambigrams. These are typographical designs where the words read the exact same way when you flip them upside down. Words like earth, air, fire, water.
Which looks super cool, by the way.
They do. From an analytical perspective, these ambigrams are purely symbolic devices within the narrative. They represent duality.
Duality, like good and evil.
Yes. They visualize the blurred lines between good and evil and the inherent twisting tension between science and religion that drives the plot. It's a visual representation of the postmodern idea we discussed earlier. Truth depends entirely on your perspective and how you hold the text.
I love that. Okay, I'm stuck on another symbol, though. The all-seeing eye.
Ah, the classics.
Yeah, I look at the back of a US dollar bill and I see it sitting on top of a pyramid, and Brown makes it feel like this massive, unified Illuminati signature hiding in plain sight. But how does an ancient symbol actually migrate onto American currency? Is there a literal paper trail of a secret society, or is this just cultural copy-pasting?
It is largely cultural adaptation. Our sources trace the all-seeing eye back to Egyptian paganism, specifically the mythic trinity of Osiris, Isis, and Horus.
Oh, the Eye of Horus.
Right. Legend says Horus lost his eye in a cosmic battle, and it was replaced by magic, becoming a symbol of a deity watching over and protecting his worshippers.
And then it just got passed around.
Over centuries, yes. This powerful visual of a protective divine eye was adapted and co-opted. Christianity adopted it as the Eye of Providence, representing God watching over humanity, often enclosed in a triangle to represent the Trinity.
And then the Freemasons adopted it.
Yes, Freemasonry incorporated it as a reminder that the great architect of the universe observes all deeds. It was popular in 18th century iconography, which is exactly why it ended up on the Great Seal of the United States.
So it's not a grand conspiracy.
No. Dan Brown uses it to show how ancient beliefs are constantly recycled and hidden in plain sight, implying a continuous, unbroken chain of a single secret society, when historically it's just different groups finding the same visual metaphor compelling.
And he does the same thing with massive architecture, right? The pyramids and obelisks.
Exactly. The interpretation utilized in the books is that pyramids represent a rigid, hidden social hierarchy, a tiny, enlightened elite at the top ruling over the massive, ignorant base of humanity at the bottom. And the obelisk, like the massive 80-foot stone monument sitting right in the middle of St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, has origins as a phallic symbol representing the Egyptian god Osiris.
Which is just incredible to think about when you visualize it.
Yeah.
I mean, the absolute center of the Catholic world, the plaza where the Pope addresses the faithful, features a massive ancient Egyptian phallic symbol that was hauled over by the Roman Emperor Caligula.
It's quite the juxtaposition.
It really plays into Brown's theme that symbols are incredibly fluid and hold multiple contradictory meanings depending on who is standing in front of them. He even uses the Star of David or the Seal of Solomon, portraying it not just as a Jewish symbol, but trying to contextualize it as an ancient symbol of the sacred union of male and female, the blade and the chalice.
And our sources note that Brown does this deliberately to jar the reader. He wants to force the reader to rethink their core religious and cultural assumptions by showing them that the symbols they trust implicitly have wildly different, often pagan, origins.
I love the analogy here. To me, historical symbols are like open source software.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Like, an ancient Egyptian writes the original code for an obelisk. Hundreds of years later, a Roman emperor downloads it to show off his power. Then a Renaissance pope modifies it for the Vatican server to show the triumph of Christianity over paganism. And then, hundreds of years later, Dan Brown comes along and builds a best-selling smartphone app out of it.
That is brilliant.
The original intent of the code is totally overwritten, but the underlying structure is still there.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the semiotics of the book. And it aligns perfectly with a concept brought up in the Rosicrucian Mystical Review included in our sources.
Oh, the Rosicrucian Review. What do they say?
The Rosicrucian perspective introduces a really brilliant maxim, be a walking question mark.
Be a walking question mark. I really like that. What does that mean in this context?
It argues that the true appeal of these symbols, and the reason Brown's books resonate so deeply, is that they remind us that the world is constructed from ever-changing notions. History is deeply fluid. It is inevitably written by the winners.
Right.
The review points out a great historical example. Do we call it the Civil War or the war between the states?
Oh, wow.
The label you use depends entirely on the geographical and cultural perspective of who is telling the history. The symbols remind us that our grasp on reality is subjective.
Which brings us to perhaps the biggest, most controversial subjective rewriting of history in the entire book: the role of women.
This is a massive topic.
It really is. A huge part of the book's cultural appeal, and a huge reason for its unprecedented sales, was its explicit claim to reclaim the sacred feminine. The book argues it is correcting the patriarchal historical record that erased women's power.
Right.
But does the text actually succeed as a feminist work? Let's look at the highly detailed scholarly feminist critique in our sources.
This is a fiercely debated area in literary circles. The novel explicitly posits that in ancient pre-Christian times, the natural sexual union between man and woman made them spiritually whole. It was a balanced divine dichotomy.
Okay.
However, the narrative claims that the male-dominated early church intentionally demonized this union, and specifically demonized women, to consolidate power, turning women into what the book calls the psychologically vulnerable sex.
And the narrative counter to this patriarchal suppression is the female protagonist, Sophie Neveu.
Yes, Sophie.
If you just look at the plot summary, she sounds great. She is a brilliant French police code breaker. She is introduced literally saving the male lead, Robert Langdon, from being arrested. She is intelligent, proactive, and central to solving the puzzle.
She definitely drives the action.
Right. So on paper, that sounds like a massive feminist win for a blockbuster thriller written by a man in 2003.
On the surface level, it definitely appears to be. But the scholarly critique in our stack of sources takes a much closer, much more critical look at the underlying mechanics of the text.
Okay, what do they find?
The critique argues that despite Brown's ostensibly good intentions to elevate the feminine, the novel falls deeply into the traps of difference feminism, or cultural feminism.
Okay, I need an everyday analogy for difference feminism, because it sounds like it should mean recognizing differences, which is good, but academic critiques usually mean it's a trap.
Think of it like the men are from Mars, women are from Venus pop psychology craze of the 1990s.
Oh, I remember that.
Difference feminism emphasizes that men and women are fundamentally inherently different in their natures, often reinforcing strict gender binaries. It says men are naturally analytical and aggressive, while women are naturally intuitive and nurturing.
I see.
It argues these traits are perfectly equal, but fundamentally opposite.
Ah, okay. So by saying two things are perfectly equal but fundamentally opposite, you still end up trapping people in highly restrictive boxes based on their biology.
Exactly. In the context of the novel, Brown presents this idea that the male and female must be perfectly balanced to avoid chaos in the world.
Which sounds harmonic and nice.
It does, but the critique argues it reinforces the idea that women have specific biologically determined roles that are strictly complementary to men. It struggles to view women as entirely independent agents outside of their relation to male figures.
And we see this explicitly in how the book handled Mary Magdalene, right? I mean, the book claims to be elevating her from a smeared prostitute to a literal goddess.
The book claims to elevate her, but the feminist critique points out that it actually strips Magdalene of her historical and spiritual agency.
How so?
In early Christian texts, both canonical and non-canonical, there is evidence of Mary Magdalene as an independent leader, a primary disciple, a crucial witness. But in the Da Vinci Code, her entire supreme importance is reduced solely to her biology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she is referred to repeatedly as the holy vessel or the literal womb that carried Jesus's royal bloodline.
That is a devastating critique when you spell it out like that. She goes from being a silenced historical leader with her own voice to just being a biological container for a man's legacy.
Exactly.
Her power isn't her mind or her faith. Her power is literally just her uterus.
That is the core of the academic pushback.
What about Sophie Neveu? Does the brilliant codebreaker fare any better under this academic lens?
Unfortunately, the critique finds that Sophie's character mechanics are also boxed into very traditional, limiting tropes. Yes, she is highly intelligent, but the author takes pains to describe her in a very specific way. She is exceptionally beautiful, but the text emphasizes she is unembellished. It falls into the classic, not like other girls trope.
Right. She's gorgeous, but doesn't try to be. She doesn't wear makeup, which somehow makes her morally and intellectually superior to the girls who do try. It's a very male gaze way of writing a strong female character.
Furthermore, despite her independence and intellect driving the plot throughout the book, the narrative arc ultimately reverts her to a traditional romance with Langdon at the end.
Of course it does.
And the most glaring issue the critique highlights is the ultimate reveal of her character. How does she achieve her final status in the story? She doesn't save the world purely through her intellect or her code-breaking skills. Her ultimate value is tied to her genetics. She is revealed to be a literal hidden princess, a direct biological descendant of the Jesus and Mary Magdalene bloodline.
Oh, right. So her ultimate power is inherited, not earned.
Exactly.
I hear all of that, and the academic critique is incredibly thorough and valid.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to pose a pragmatic question here, because we are talking about a mass market thriller.
Okay, let's be pragmatic.
This is a book that was bought in airport kiosks and read on beaches. If you're listening to this and thinking, wait, I love Sophie Neveu, I thought she was a great hero, you're not alone. Is it entirely fair to hold a pop culture mystery novel to the rigorous, highly nuanced standards of complex feminist academic theory?
It's a fair question.
I mean, isn't the simple act of having a female intellectual who regularly outsmarts the male lead and who exposes the historical oppression of women to a massive audience still a net positive for the thriller genre, even if she does end up being a literal princess?
You're highlighting the tension between academic theory and cultural impact. You really have to evaluate the text within its genre constraints.
Right.
Thrillers inherently rely on tropes. They rely on romance subplots, hidden identities, and secret royalty to create dramatic payoffs. For millions of readers, this book was their very first introduction to the concept of the sacred feminine, or the idea that history has systematically erased or minimized women's contributions.
It was almost like a gateway drug to feminist history for people who would never pick up an academic textbook.
Precisely. The academic execution might be deeply flawed and reliant on strict binaries, but the cultural impact of introducing those subversive concepts to an audience of 80 million people is undeniably significant. It started a massive global conversation that simply wouldn't have happened otherwise.
So Brown essentially builds this empire by co-opting ancient symbols, alternative histories, and feminist theories to challenge institutional power.
Yes, he does.
But there's a massive irony here. While he's writing a book critiquing ancient institutions for stealing history and hiding the truth, other authors were quietly preparing to drag him into court, claiming he stole the very conspiracy he was getting rich off of.
It is the inevitable byproduct of a massive cultural phenomenon. When a book generates as much wealth and cultural saturation as the Da Vinci Code did, lawsuits will absolutely follow. And Dan Brown faced multiple, highly publicized copyright infringement lawsuits.
And the most famous of these, by far, came from Michael Bagent and Richard Lee.
Yes, they were two of the three authors of a highly controversial 1982 book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail.
And this detail is absolutely crucial to the legal battle. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was published, marketed, and defended by its authors as a nonfiction historical investigation.
That is the key detail.
Right. It is the specific book that originally popularized the hypothesis that Jesus and Mary Magdalene married, had a child, and founded the Merovingian bloodline in France.
That's correct. Dan Brown didn't invent the court conspiracy theory. He popularized an existing theory by wrapping it in a fictional thriller.
So what do they sue him for?
Bezam and Lee sued Brown's UK publisher, Random House, for breach of copyright. They claimed he didn't just borrow a fact or two. They argued he essentially plagiarized the entire architecture of their historical research and made it the central framework of his novel.
And there were other suits as well, right?
There were. Authors like Louis Perdue, who wrote a novel called Daughter of God, and Jack Dunn, who wrote The Vatican Boys, both filed suits claiming Brown lifted overarching thematic structures, specific plot points, and character dynamics.
So what happened in these trials? I mean, how do you legally prove someone stole a historical conspiracy?
The courts universally ruled in Dan Brown's favor across the board.
Wow, universal wins.
Yes. The overarching legal precedent that was established, or rather strongly reinforced in these rulings, is a fundamental tenet of copyright law. You cannot plagiarize history, and you cannot copyright overarching thematic structures or generalized ideas.
Right, because if a book claims to be nonfiction, if the authors go on record claiming they're presenting actual, verifiable historical facts, then those facts basically belong to the public domain.
Exactly.
Anyone can write a novel based on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or the sinking of the Titanic because they're historical events.
Exactly. Dan Brown's defense team essentially argued, you, the plaintiffs, claim your book is real history. Therefore, I am perfectly allowed to use that history as the factual backdrop for my fictional story. You can't own historical truth.
Which is just a delicious, incredible, mind-bending irony.
Yeah.
Think about the layers happening in that courtroom. Dan Brown gets sued for allegedly stealing the historical theories of a nonfiction book.
Right.
His ultimate successful legal defense is, you cannot copyright historical facts. Meanwhile, simultaneously outside the courthouse, the entire religious and academic world is screaming at him because those exact same historical facts are completely verifiably made up.
It is a postmodern masterpiece happening right in a court of law.
It really is. The lines between what is fact, what is fiction, what is owned intellectual property, and what is public domain all collapse simultaneously in that trial.
And this brings us right back to our hook at the beginning of the deep dive. Because the judge in the Bajan and Lay case, High Court Judge Sir Peter Smith, seemed to fully embrace the absurdity of the situation.
Right, the Smithy Code. He embedded his own cryptographic puzzle in the official legal judgment.
Yes. In a twist that perfectly mirrored the themes of the novel he was judging, he italicized letters to spell out a message regarding Admiral Jackie Fisher.
So funny.
But while the judge was willing to play the symbology game, he was not entirely kind to Dan Brown's reputation.
Oh, really? Did he criticize the writing?
He criticized the methodology. While Judge Smith ruled in Brown's favor legally, he used the published judgment to severely criticize Brown's claims of being a deep, thorough historical researcher.
Ouch.
The judge noted that Brown's evidence and testimony in court showed that his historical research was actually largely superficial. It was revealed that Brown relied heavily on synopses and research notes prepared by his wife, Blythe.
So the trial saves his fortune, but the judge essentially goes on the official public record to say the claim that 99% of this is fact is total nonsense.
Exactly.
It is the perfect capstone to the entire phenomenon. The legal system protected his right to write fiction based on ideas, but the trial process completely exposed the fragile scaffolding holding up that fact page at the beginning of the book.
It perfectly illustrates the tension we've been tracking this entire time. People want to believe in the hidden truth so badly that they will overlook the scaffolding holding it up.
Which brings us to the ultimate question for you, the listener. Why did we just spend an hour deep diving into the religious, legal, and literary controversies of a paperback thriller published over 20 years ago?
Because this isn't just about debunking Dan Brown.
No, it's a profound exploration of how incredibly fragile our perceptions of history truly are.
It demonstrates how deeply, fundamentally, human beings crave hidden knowledge. We want to believe there is a secret pattern behind the chaos of the world. We want to believe that the grand narratives can be decoded.
We want to believe the map of reality has hidden paths.
And it proves how effectively a compelling, fast-paced narrative can completely overwrite public memory and shake institutional authority.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling thought to ponder. The Da Vinci Code proved, without a shadow of a doubt, how easily the human mind will adopt complete fiction as reality, so long as it is propped up by a few verifiable facts, a confident tone, and a single page at the front titled Fact.
It was a global test case in mass cognitive vulnerability.
And that was back in 2003. So ask yourself this. If a simple paperback novel could successfully convince millions of people of a fabricated history 20 years ago, How equipped are we today?
That's a scary thought.
How equipped are you to discern reality in our current era? We are living in a world flooded with AI-generated content, of algorithmic news feeds perfectly designed to confirm our existing biases, of deepfakes that can seamlessly make anyone say anything on video.
The lines are more blurred than ever.
If our map of history was that easily redrawn by a fictional thriller with a fake fact page, what happens to our map of the future when the ink is being drawn by invisible algorithms?
If our history is that malleable, the future is entirely up for grabs.
The borders are written in invisible ink, and the map is changing as we speak. Keep questioning the narrative. Keep looking for the sleight of hand. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.